Greetings and salutations, fellow book readers. This is Mark, and the book I will review today is Travels by Paul Bowles. Before we continue, this is personalized limited edition of Travels with leather cover designed and made by me. At the end of the video, I will tell you a couple of ways of how you can get one for yourself if you are interested. Now let's get back to the review. Travels, Collected Writings, 1950-1993, is a collection of articles and private journal entries written by the famous American writer Paul Bowles over a period of more than 40 years. Bowles can be seen as a symbol of the American expatriate, and for many he is connected to the Moroccan city of Tangier, where he spent more than 50 years of his life. He was visited there by many famous individuals, mostly writers, the Beats, Ginsberg, Burroughs, Kerouac, also Truman Capote, and Mick Jagger with the Rolling Stones, who were inspired by Moroccan music. And there were many others. Throughout his life, Bowles identified as an outsider, with his family in New York, later in Paris, and then in Morocco, as he said himself, each time different, but always an outsider. Maybe his need for travel came from feeling out of place anywhere, which he seemed to enjoy. Bowles was a prolific and diverse writer. He wrote music, some of it for films and Broadway plays, in collaboration with some big names of those times, Orson Welles, Tennessee Williams, etc., even though he never had any formal training in music. He also wrote many short stories, considered some of the best ever written by an American. Further, Bowles wrote poetry and did translations from a variety of languages. And there were also a few novels, the first and the most famous being Sheltering Sky, which was beautifully adapted into a film by famous Italian director Bernardo Bertolucci and starring John Malkovich and Debra Winger, the protagonist being inspired by Bowles and his wife. His marriage to his wife Jane seemed to be motivated more by friendship and convenience. It was open since they both had strong homosexual tendencies, while the wife seemed to prefer exclusively lesbian encounters. I think above all, Bowles enjoyed his wife's friendship and company. He would take her with him on his trips as often as he could. She also seemed to motivate or even inspire his creativity. After Jane died in 1973, he never wrote another novel. Also, many female characters created by Bowles were inspired on Jane, her personality. She was a very eccentric and troubled spirit who offered a lot of material to be exploited by a creative individual such as Bowles. Jane spent half of her life in Tangier with Bowles, which she seemed to despise, especially after the Moroccan independence, when the city became more conservative and patriarchal, and maybe the stress of it all, having to hide her lesbian relationships, contributed to her premature death. On the other hand, Bowles seemed pretty happy in Tangier and North Africa in general, and it seemed it was the place where he got the closest feeling of being at home. What is Travels about? It is Bowles' experiences, reflections, and opinions on his travel life, presented through articles he wrote and private notes from his journals. A bit of the plot, which I will supplement with my thoughts. The book starts with the introduction written by Paul Theroux, who is the famous American travel writer and whose books I enjoy. Theroux visited Bowles in the 1990s, a few years before the latter's death, and he describes the encounter in his book about traveling around the Mediterranean, The Pillars of Hercules. Paul Bowles of the stereotype is the golden man, the enigmatic exile, elegantly dressed, a cigarette holder between his fingers, luxuriating in the Moroccan sunshine, living on remittances, occasionally offering his alarming and highly polished fictions to the wider world. This portrait has a grain of truth, but there is much more to know. Certainly, Bowles had style and a success with one book, but a single book, even a popular one, seldom guarantees a regular income. And quite apart from money, Bowles's life was complicated emotionally, sexually, geographically, and without a doubt creatively. The first couple of chapters, based on a personal journal and an article written for Holiday magazine, are about Paris. It is about young teenage Bowles visiting the City of Lights in the early 1930s, where remainers of the lost generation were still living, specifically Gertrude Stein, also James Joyce and Picasso. He watches black dancers and remembers he has never seen black people dance back in America. It shows how segregated the US was compared to Europe. And then again, in Europe, blacks were seen more as an exotic novelty since their population was so low there. Also, Bowles writes how Paris can only be absorbed and discovered through walking the streets. I think his descriptions of the city are as good and as interesting as Hemingway's. To be 17 and in Paris, free to do as one liked, that was an ideal state of affairs for any aspiring artist or writer a generation ago. It was ideal even without money, perhaps especially without money. Bowles arrived in the city about the same time as Henry Miller, but their descriptions are very different. Bowles remembers a very distinct and appealing smell of Paris subway, which stayed with him for many years. He describes the Paris art scene, its workings, the French only buying French paintings, etc., etc. Also, the beginning of Paris's gentrification, the poor bohemian artists moving to the suburbs because the city center is being taken over by the rich, locals and visitors. It also happened to New York and London, and now it's happening to Lisbon and Barcelona, where I live. The city is losing its identity and becoming a playground, a tourist resort. So the visitors who come for the real experience get nothing more than a Hollywood version of it. Perhaps it is a self-destructive cycle, and eventually the tourists will discover a new, more authentic destination and stop coming. And maybe we'll be able to go back to some version of normality. Bowles writes about Fez, a famous city in Morocco, which he found a lot more authentic, maybe even the most authentic in the country. Fassi believed that the Western world is about to disintegrate. Obviously, it can only be Islam which will triumph. This very narrowness of ideas has kept the place pure, kept it medieval. For the Westerner does not so much feel in a distant place here, the removal is rather in time. 1,000 years ago, the cities of Europe must have been very much like this. From all accounts, there is little difference, save in detail. Bowles tells us what makes Fez one of the world's great cities, and it is not its history or monuments, but its people, who are somewhat happily stuck in the past. It is in Fez that the Moroccans are most traditional and religious, still nostalgic for the times when the Muslim Empire included a large part of Spain. For them, it seems that time doesn't move much and it circles, and eventually it will go back to what they consider normality. Because of it, they are patient and never seem to be in a rush. But why should you want to arrive sooner? What do you do when you get there that you couldn't do if you get there later? Perhaps the French think if they go fast enough, that won't catch up with them. And he laughs because he thinks that Western civilization is attempting to escape from a fate which is predetermined, written as they put it in Arabic. Any such effort naturally is doomed to failure. Bowles also writes about Sri Lanka, the old English colony of Ceylon, where he bought a small island so he could balance his desert life in North Africa with some green and humid tropics. And he discovers his interest in parrots, in their ability to speak, wondering whether it was just mimicking or something more intellectual. I think he always kept a few in his home in Tangier. A lot of the writing is dedicated to what Bowles considered his home, Tangier, especially when it was part of the international zone, when many Europeans and Americans were moving there because of its great climate, financial opportunities, legal and illegal, and they believed that the Americans would not let anybody invade it. The construction boom and growing inflation were making the place somewhat expensive to live compared to how inexpensive it was before, but still many people coming, probably motivated by the very few restrictions and availability of drugs, hashish, consumed in many different forms. Each week more new faces haunt the native cafes behind the Zoco Chico. While a few may be French, most of them are Americans, and they are in passionate pursuit of one thing, an absolute detachment from what is ordinarily called reality. Basically, the place was pretty liberal and tolerant, and then the Moroccan independence movement arrived, which encouraged by different means the foreigners to leave and stay away. Moroccans became aware of Europe's weakness caused by the World War II and sensed an opportunity to regain control. Bowles mentions the changes, physical and social, all this development brought to the city. This city has changed to such an extent since I first settled here in 1931 that if my strongest memories from that period were not inextricably connected with its climate and weather, I should no longer recognize it as the same place. The air and the wind are really about all that is left. When Bowles moved to Tangier, the place was a very desirable location for many. You were in no man's land, wild Africa on one side and full of rules Europe on the other, but Tangier was neither, and it offered a certain level of isolation, which often brings the feeling of peace. There was no need for visa, and the place was pretty cheap. But at the same time, the civilized world, Europe, was so close. Bowles wrote that on a clear day, the mountains of Spain looked like they were across the street. Tangier was a mix of nationalities, cultures, and religions, and maybe because of it, it offered something to everybody. Of course, this Tangier doesn't exist anymore. It slowly went away with the post-colonial 20th century. But there is some rebirth of the city as the international hotspot with the new infrastructure expansion projects to take advantage of its location, the crossroads at the gate of the Mediterranean. And the people are coming back, buying properties, especially the French. Bowles also writes about Sahara, his visits to different parts of it, and he describes the feeling of being surrounded by the desert, the impact it had on him and others, the mystery and peace one feels when there. Immediately when you arrive in the Sahara for the first or the 10th time, you notice the stillness. For no one who has stayed in the Sahara for a while is quite the same as when he came. Further, he talks about Sahara's fauna and geology and history of the human habitations of the region, how the conditions influence the local culture and customs. For example, the land is not measured by its area but by the amount of trees it has, and the fertile land in proximity to water is used for cultivation and not habitation. The houses are built some distance away. Also, the extreme of the temperature, being unbearably hot during the day, and often the temperature falling below freezing right before the dawn, and the difficulty of securing shelter and food when traveling in the desert. So the logical question that might arise in the reader is why live or even go there? And Bowles gives the answer. Perhaps the logical question to ask at this point is, why go? The answer is that when a man has been there and undergone the baptism of solitude, he can't help himself. Once he has been under the spell of the vast, luminous, silent country, no other place is quite strong enough for him. No other surroundings can provide the supremely satisfying sensation of existing in the midst of something that is absolute. He will go back whatever the cost in comfort and money, for the absolute has no price. Besides the before-mentioned subjects, Bowles writes about Islam, which was always present in some form in his daily life, in his habitat, places he frequented, and the people he knew and worked for him. It is Islam described through its history, culture, and traditions. It seems since the end of the World War II and European colonialism, we are into the third major expansion of Islam, the first being the initial wave after the formation of the religion, which went all the way to Spain, and the second, the Ottoman Turk conquests. The difference is that the earlier two were more military, and this one is demographic. Perhaps, ironically, Islam can save Europe by making conservatives more popular, since the progressive ideology has gotten a bit out of control. It is pretty visible here in the West, where chaos seems to have become a new normal. There is a pretty good book by the polemic French writer Michel Houellebecq titled Submission. The plot is based on the premise that an Islamist party wins the French presidential election. It puts the whole dilemma of Islam into a more practical context. Bowles also talks about the differences between Islam and Christianity, such as one permitting drugs and the other alcohol as a form of relaxation. There are more stories, travels to sub-Saharan Africa, South Asia, and the island of Madeira, the independence struggle from the Algerians' point of view, researching and collecting samples of local music. Also Bowles' not so flattering opinion of Casablanca, for many the symbol of Morocco, and on the other hand, the very different feeling he has when in Marrakesh. Bowles' extensive travels came to a rather abrupt end when his wife died. After that, it seemed to him that nothing more happened. He went on living in Tangier, translating from Arabic, French, and Spanish. He wrote many short stories, but no novels. There continued to be more and more people in the world, and there was nothing anyone could do about anything. He lived for another quarter of a century, but settled to a sedentary lifestyle. Probably it was from a lack of travel companion, but also his age, not seeing fun anymore in roughing it. What are my thoughts about travels? This is a very good sample of Paul Bowles' writings, his interests, fascinations with different cultures, opinions, and conclusions he draws from his observations while traveling, what he learned, which gives a good profile of him, a bit as a private person, but more as a writer of what he wants to disclose to the public. Some of it, to me, feels intimate, but probably not as intimate as what he reveals indirectly in his short stories and novels. Bowles wrote for a variety of periodicals, and each chapter is about a certain place or time period in his life. But in general, it is travel in the old days, when travelers were more sophisticated and educated, because back then you had to have means to travel. It took effort and money, relatively more money, so it was more exclusive, less crowded, and it had more transformative power on the individual. And today, on the road, we often find ourselves surrounded by Philistines, sometimes drunk, looking for a cheap thrill and a few photos for their Instagram account. So it is more about them than the place they are visiting. A lot of Bowles' travels were at the end of the colonial era in Africa and South Asia, so there is the impact of the changing world, especially the attitudes of the natives, their growing confidence, hostility, and opportunism, growing independence movements, not only in Morocco, but in Algeria and Kenya as well. Also, desperate efforts of the colonial powers to hold on to their possessions and maintain some control over them. The argument is that the government by Africans would mean the end of civilization in Kenya and a reversion to the Dark Ages, to the countless centuries when the Africans ruled themselves and produced absolutely nothing. The Africans' answer to this line is that for a colonial power which can maintain itself only by imposing the conditions that obtain today in Kenya, it is impolitic even to mention the word civilization. For them, a reversion to the Dark Ages might be an improvement. And there are the new attitudes in the newly independent countries. They're pretty ambitious plans for the new and, as they see, bright future, such as the independent Morocco regained the control of the two Spanish cities in North Africa, Ceuta and Melilla. Maybe regain is not the right word, since I don't think they were ever part of Morocco. Anyway, they are still pretty much part of Spain, just like Gibraltar is still British. Perhaps the new idea is to win those cities demographically with votes. But there are laws in the constitution that are specifically designed to prevent this kind of political changes. On the other hand, as countries in the West are becoming more chaotic and moving away from being governed by laws and start to give in to the pressures of the so-called democratic mob, anything could happen. To sum it up, Travels is a sample of Ball's travel writings and travel life, which might seem enjoyable and easygoing when reading about it, but it was not. Bowles was far from the dandy dilettante that he is sometimes perceived to be. In the 62 years they represent, from 1931 to 1933, Bowles was a serious and extremely hard-working writer trying to make a living. He probably spent a lot of time looking for sponsors for his travels or selling what he produced. Travel was more difficult back then. Difficulty in securing lodging, sometimes sleeping in the receptions or bathrooms, also scarcity of food in certain areas. I wonder how many people today would do it under the same conditions. Okay, let's talk about the physical book. The book I am holding is a paperback which I transformed into hardcover leather-bound edition. To make the cover I use grade A, naturally 10 high. I buy from a tannery in North Spain. It is the same leather Louis Vuitton uses to make his bags, so it is top quality. I do all the processing of the leather myself. First I design the cover, and for this I use an old travel poster which advertised North Africa as a travel destination. There is a Mediterranean town and a mosque and a caravan traveling through the desert, and in the background an island with some Roman ruins. I thought it nicely shows the diversity of the area, and for me it relates to the book. A lot of it describes North Africa, which was the favorite place of the author. This is the back with the blurb, and inside front cover I printed a quote from the book. If you want to see a more detailed video where I explain how I transform paperback into leather-bound hardcover, click on the link in the description. I will make maximum of 100 editions of each title. Each one will be numbered and initialed, and the numbers will go in chronological order from 2 up, since number 1 stays with me. The price will be around $100, so if you would like me to make one for you, you can click below on my email and send me a message. I do not guarantee I will do it, since it will depend on the time I have available, access to leather, and if I can get my hands on the copy of the book. Now, if you're not willing to spend $100 but you still want the book, what you can do is click below on the PayPal link and donate $3 or more to my channel, and for every 100 donations I will make a lottery and draw one name, and the winner will receive the book. So if you are cheap but feel lucky, this might be the way to do it. Also, your donations give me the extra motivation to make the book reviews, and I appreciate them very much, so thank you in advance. One more thing, when you make your donation, remember to include the title of the book you would like to win. The book itself is beautiful. Visually it has a very nice texture, it smells great, and the more you handle it, the more beautiful it will become. And it makes a great gift for yourself or somebody who appreciates books. So if you want one, don't snooze or you might lose. Well, that's it, so let's end it here. And until next time, keep your ear close to the ground and read a book. Adios.